You mentioned, I listened to an interview the other day, and you've spent a lot of time in Jacksonville. And you mentioned wanting to get back up here, walk around, and in your presentation, and see what's new, what's changed. You mentioned a few things. What are we doing right? You mentioned parks. Anything else that you noticed that really stood out to you?
Well, of course, a ton of things. I mentioned some of them, but I'll just recap. I think historic preservation is in full swing here. And that's interesting because in many communities it's sort of waned, became a regulatory function. And I perceive, this is just my archaeological eyes looking at what I see in the scene, that you actually have a lot of people here employing historic preservation as an economic development tool. And that's really where it does its best. So thank goodness for that. Not that you aren't still losing things and that there isn't a need to save more things, and perhaps rebuild some of the things that were lost. So first I'll say historic preservation and adaptive reuse is encouraging. Second, you have in places like Amelia Park, right here in this region, textbook examples of what it looks like when you do it right. Proven by, of course, the popularity among home buyers and seekers, and by the success of building a place where people can age within their neighborhood without having to leave all their friends. This is Joel Embry's triumph, I think, in Amelia Park. We bring people from Miami and Atlanta to come see Amelia Park, Joel, so I want you to know that it means that much to us. So that's encouraging. And then in town, of course, you can look at the map, the heat map of property values. You can realize that the customers value San Marco, Springfield, Riverside, and Avondale. That should tell you something. If you want to succeed, build more of those. Don't build that other thing that people like so much less. I think that's another sign. And then on the big stuff, you have, with the infill development in the Brooklyn area, for example, brought back in-city living, with mixed-use downstairs, and are starting to recover the building-to-street relationships. There's still work to do on that. And all of this waterfront park space that you meticulously and painfully and expensively assembled over a long period of time, and now you're turning into not just acres that are in reserve for doing that, but you're turning them into parks and connecting them with the Riverwalk and so on. I'm very encouraged by that as well. So those are just a few of the things. I wish you could have all had lunch with us today. Because I sat with a dozen or so of your neighbors and friends, and the optimism was just thick in that room. The most valuable tool you have is contagious optimism.
We have that in abundance in Jacksonville. You talked about pedestrians and this street.
People on foot.
And speed. This street out in front of us is a great example. If you go 4 or 5 blocks north,
which I have,
you've got 6 or 7 lanes of traffic. And so, if you're trying to walk dogs, if you're a pedestrian trying to walk dogs across 7 lanes, if God forbid you have mobility challenges and you have a cane, what do we do to convince politicians, to convince voters, obviously, our fellow citizens that speed is not always the answer? How do we shrink our roads to be pedestrian friendly?
Okay. Well, of course, nothing succeeds like success, and the most valuable tool is a proof of concept. Notwithstanding the fact that your historic places are proof in abundance, but it can be very reassuring and confidence building to get some new thing done that where the priority has been put on safety and beauty and agreeableness for people, and flow has been honored but regulated to a second-class status compared to safety. If you do that, and you'll discover some interesting things. One, and I know that you have this context-sensitive streets program that the city's worked on for years. This is a good sign of this. If you assume wider and faster roads are better roads, and you start with the idea that there are all these car trips and then some theoretical forecast background traffic percentage of growth for every year that you're going to apply on top of that, and you start your design in the center of the road, adding as many lanes as the computer tells you you need to add for free-flowing traffic at the peak hour, don't be surprised if after that, as a street designer, you have to turn to the mayor and say, I'm sorry, but there's really no room for street trees. Or you have to turn to the leader of the neighborhood association and say, I'm sorry, there's really no room for bike accommodation or for a wide sidewalk. If you start with the pedestrians, those people on foot, and you make them happy, because remember, walkability is actually a proxy term for livability and healthy communities in every respect, economically and otherwise. If you start with making it a place where pedestrians are comfortable, and then, to the extent necessary, without letting them dominate you, you accommodate the moving van and the garbage truck and the fire truck and the peak hour traffic. You will be much more likely to succeed. And the traffic engineering business, the folks in that industry have been really kind of taking this up over the last couple decades. In Florida, they rewrote all the manuals, for example, about 10 years ago, updated it again another 6 years ago, to throw out all the old books that said the engineers had to tell you no. The book says right here, I'm sorry, Madam Council Member, you can't have those street trees. The book says I'm not allowed to give you those. Now, at least on the state streets, and to the extent that the city and county are following that trend, they have a different book. In that book, it says, oh, one size doesn't fit all. This is the city. Well, then you can have a slower design speed and a narrower travel lane. And you can have street trees. They have permission now to say yes. Caveat, that doesn't mean they always will. Is my old friend Jim Knight in the room? Jim will confirm this. They will tell you no 6 times and then say yes the 7th time. So you have to be persistent.
So how important, we historically, let's say the last few decades, when we're designing sidewalks and streets in Jacksonville, it seems that we throw up a few palm trees and crepe myrtles and we've got, that's our design. And that doesn't really work in August and September if you're trying to encourage people to bike and walk. Are shade trees an important part of design?
That's a softball question.
I'm setting you up.
If you Google me, you'll find out I'm obsessed with street trees. I think they're the most important thing. Henry Arnold, the great landscape architect, said that street trees are 50% of urban design. I believe he was absolutely correct. And it's not complicated. First rule of design, line things up. Just plant a row of street trees. Draw 2 lines on the map and then plant trees at regular spacing. And you will be giving a gift that will, to every successive generation for hundreds of years. It's not that complicated. Then we got out of the habit.
I figured you deserved.
They have a lot more benefits than just making it shady or to walk in August. The street trees calm traffic because those trees in your field of vision make you think, I'd better drive as if slow is safe and not just tear ass around the neighborhood. So you'll see safety improve. And they hold water. They provide a kind of shade that you probably forget about, which is they're lowering the cooling costs of the adjacent buildings, lowering the urban heat island effect. And guess what? They make oxygen, and we breathe that stuff. It's really useful.
Are there, when we talk about design, are there fundamentals, let's say in our core neighborhoods and even in the suburbs, that they're fundamental that we all should agree on? Garages that don't face the street. And I'll confess, I live in a home where the garage faces the street.
But you'll never unsee it.
I'll never unsee it. Now I know half my house goes up when I pull up. But front porches, density, are there fundamental rules that we should agree on regardless of where you're at?
Well, I think I hit on some of these in the filibuster here over the last few minutes. But, first, the building to street relationship is crucial. It's not a totally separate thing to be figured out in a different silo from the layout of the city plan or the transportation plan. Those are really all one thing. And you can't get that if you apply a bunch of abstract rules that are basically designed to inhibit and slow down development and minimize the chances of any interaction between the uses and people inside buildings. If you have deep front, rear, and side setbacks and low lot coverage maximum percentages and very high parking requirements, don't be surprised when just the zoning, not the transportation plan or the big city plan, the zoning has pushed and atomized the city apart. So that has to be fixed. That's a fundamental thing. Building the street relationship is only possible if the rules are right. That's the DNA fixing I spoke about. Now, I would say the next one is that the land uses or the activities inside buildings are truly secondary. All up and down this street, we have buildings that started for one purpose and then were reinvented for another purpose. So historic preservation and adaptive reuse tell us that really the land use is just kind of a temporary thing, like an item on your shopping list. But if the building has enough dignity, makes a great address out of that street corner, where a lot of people would want to be. They'd take that old house and turn it into their law office, and the world will not come to an end. Or maybe years later, turn it back into a law office or subdivide it into several apartments. In Savannah, I love to use Savannah for examples, but especially here because it's so close. You can just go up there and take a look. In Savannah, if you look at the historic engravings of the city as it was beginning, you can see the initial genius of the plan, the wards with their squares and the grid of streets. And what you'll also see is that in the beginning, with cabins basically, Savannah was a single-family detached house, large lot, low-density subdivision. That's what it was. But it was actually allowed to evolve so that the next round of buildings replaced the wooden ones with brick ones. The next round of buildings were attached to each other, and so one lot became three. Later, some of these were divided into flats that were flats. And so over time, Savannah is 9 or 10 or 15 times as dense as it began, on the same street network with the same squares and the same corner stores and churches. And guess what? Things got better rather than worse. And that set the stage for institutional prosperity. So Savannah College of Art and Design and their students reawakened the National Landmark Historic District in Savannah because all of the architectural tools were already in place to allow that to happen. So I think the rules are pretty important.
Give me an example. Have you seen projects that maybe they looked great on paper, the design was great, and for whatever reason, maybe it was a misunderstanding of human behavior and how humans would interact with it, it didn't work?
Can we just thank Abel for the most diplomatically worded question of the night? Okay, because what he could have said is, how come some of your built projects don't look as good as your renderings? And guilty as charged. Well, first, let's start on the renderings. I think we should aim high. We should be showing the ideal, the best it can be, not just how much less bad it can be, and inspiring people to do their best work as best as they can. And that will always run into the buzzsaw of diluting factors, whether it's the old standards that really, the last time the fire marshal went to a conference and learned about these things was in 1971. You're going to have some dumbing down of the plan. And we get a lot of dumbing down that comes from big systems that are beyond our control as cities or individual practitioners, like financialization. Edicts coming down from Wall Street are essentially responsible for a lot of the forms that are constructed. So there's another factor that comes in. So John Nolan, who is the patron saint of the New Urbanism and the first American to call himself a professional city planner, worked here in the 19-teens and 20s. He designed Venice over on the Gulf Coast. He designed St. Petersburg with all of its beautiful public waterfront. Designed downtown West Palm Beach, 30 new towns in Florida. Is prolific. And Nolan said that Florida is the great national laboratory for town and city building. And his next line was, so aim high in life and work. And I think what we have to do in the drawings is aim as high as we can get, knowing that it will always get chipped away at during the process. And implementation, the architects will back me up on this. Those meticulously drawn construction drawings that you did, that you got the permits on and you stamped and signed and sealed, it turns out they're just a mere suggestion for what the contractor will actually do. Everything is always going to be a little bit off. It just is. And so we should draw it as perfectly as we can because everything's going to be a little bit off. And you know what? A little bit off might actually make it a little softer and more agreeable in the end.
I want to make sure I save time for a few questions from the audience. But if you were to look ahead, kind of to wrap this segment up, if you were to look ahead 20 years for Jacksonville, what is the biggest mistake, like if a city like us that you look that we are doing that we should stop doing? What would be the biggest mistake we could make right now?
Well, it's sort of on my list. Okay. Again, at the risk of being run out of town, you're overdoing it on parking. Parking is a narcotic. It should be a controlled substance. So I look around town and I see, and I'm looking at the historic photographs and the Sanborn maps, and I can see exactly what used to be there, and what replaced it was another big honkin' lurch and spasm of concrete parking garage, or another one of those inefficient surface lots, which I know are just land banks in a way, waiting for you to fill in that lost space. If you start your designs and your infill development programs and even your financial spreadsheets with the parking, form follows parking, you will never create a great place. And usually I think this got so ingrained during the Futurama on wheels, happy motoring experiment that never was tested, but just implemented continent-wide without a field test. That got started there. Cities thought they had to compete with the distant suburbs by having even more parking than they did. Then they instituted, in order to sort of just lock this down, they instituted unreasonably high and requirements for minimum parking within the zoning code. Rules that were based on really poor science and research also as to what each land use might generate and how they might interact if you had an actual town where there were mixed uses in the same neighborhood. So if you can find a way to get over the habits of the minimum parking requirements and starting with the place you want to be instead of the parking, you'll do better. The great Fred Kent, who founded Project for Public Spaces, actually you should invite him to speak. He'd be a lot better at this than I am. Fred said, if you design a city for cars and traffic, you'll get cars and traffic. If you design a city for people and places, you can get people and places. And I think that might be it.
Thank you. We've got time. Nancy's out there if we've got a question, for a few questions.
Is it on?
How do you solve the problem where the only place you have to plant a tree between the sidewalk and the street has underground utilities 2 feet underneath, so you're not allowed to plant any shade trees?
Yeah, that's a big one. Did everybody hear the question? Okay. There are plenty of places where we could have had a row of street trees and somebody didn't think ahead about where they placed the underground utilities and essentially foreclosed that possibility until the next big failure of the system when it all has to be dug up and redone. Now, remember, I talked about how streets were this slow to change institution. You lay them down, they stay there. The stuff below ground and above ground within those rights of way tends to change every generation or two. At the very minimum, we repave, grind it off, mill it off the surface and repave it and restripe it. And quite often we do a lot more than that. And in a city the age of yours, every year, I'm sure the utilities folks would back me up on this, you have a cascade failure in a given part of the city based on its age of the sewer laterals that run from those pipes out to the surrounding buildings. Of course, one lateral fails and they have to dig it up and fix it, makes a disruption, they patch it, and then a few weeks later another one down the street fails, and then another one. And so it seems like the same street is under construction for a long time. That is a natural consequence of all of us, building heavy buildings and running heavy trucks and people back and forth across those same streets for 100 years. Eventually, that stuff's going to break. And when it does, that's your moment. Because right then, they're going to have to dig the whole thing up and replace it rather than just try to patch one every 2 weeks. When they do, you should have a plan ready that shows how, when the street is rebuilt, you want it to be. That's why, that's not the only reason to have shovel-ready plans. If you remember back during the Great Recession, when the stimulus money first started to flow, it was shovel-ready projects that got the investments to generate economic recovery. People that had drawings already figured out and a general consensus about what they really wanted to build when they get the chance, move to the front of the line for funding. And that's one of the things you can do in those situations. There's always some solution. I will say this too, that there's always a workaround of one kind or another. And you may have places where the shade needs to come from the architecture, like it did in some of those earliest 1870 buildings. The arcades and colonnades and galleries that were common in historic buildings and have become less common today. You have to give yourselves permission to let those things encroach over the sidewalk in the right-of-way. And sometimes that can be harder to achieve than asking to move a sewer pipe. But if you can build community consensus around those kinds of ideas, your menu of solutions will start to expand.
All right, so let's have one or two more questions. Here we go.
Hi there. Connecting back to your point about parking, gaze in your technological crystal ball. In 10 years, we all have access to cheap, affordable, autonomous vehicles. So we don't need the parking lots anymore because we get dropped off. Are autonomous vehicles tailwinds to your grand vision for design?
That's why my last slide had a picture of one. I'm actually, and this is not common among the new urbanists, I'm actually quite bullish about the automating and electrifying of our fleet. That's partly because I ride my bike to work, and I bet that computer is going to be better at not killing me than some of y'all, right? And so I'm optimistic about autonomous and connected vehicles. I also know when they're connected and they're talking to each other, they can see around the corner and they can tell I'm coming and tell each other about it. That doesn't happen among the motorists that are on the phone and putting on their makeup and eating breakfast and whatever they're doing. So I'm quite optimistic about that. It is totally connected to the parking thing, and one of the reasons to be hopeful. In Miami now we have Waymo, which you may have heard of in the news. Waymo is in Austin and San Francisco and Los Angeles, and for quite a while now they've been operating fully autonomous. 2 weeks ago they went fully autonomous in Miami. They're swarming around our town. I'm very encouraged by it. So what's going to happen? We will shift our relationship with cars a bit. We can go back to having a family car instead of a personal car and save a lot of money. Money you can use on student loans or the high price of housing or the high price of groceries or all the high prices that seem to get higher and higher. But that's one of the benefits. Parking is another one. So Gabe Klein, who's one of the founders of a company called Zipcar, but he also served in government as a transportation commissioner. He's plugged in with all these researchers, and he said not long ago that he thinks autonomous and connected vehicles will eventually result in a decrease in the demand for urban parking spaces of 85%. Now, I heard him say that, and I just thought, that's crazy. It can't possibly be that much. And then it suddenly dawned on me that if he was only half right, it would still be tremendous. That we would have a ton of land available in urban real estate that might be repurposed another way. Room to build the housing that we need, or install things that actually have cash registers that ring and make money instead of lose money like a parking garage. And we maybe green space.